All right. Good morning. Good morning. So I'm going to ask this question and then give my views on whether or not Vince McMahon ruined pro wrestling. Now, we know that there's a lot of big news that came out recently with the allegations from a woman that he had hired to work at WWE, that he was basically sex trafficking her to other employees of the company. I heard that John Laurinaitis and Brock Lesnar were mentioned in the complaint. And of course, you have the foul stuff in there about a orgy and Vince McMahon defecating on her head. And now he's resigned in disgrace. And as they say, ruining his legacy, right? But I'm going to go back further to the 80s, because a lot of people, I think what's happened is over the years, because Vince is obviously the most successful pro wrestling promoter in the history of the business. He took the once Northeast-based WWF and turned it into a worldwide powerhouse. And to me, those accomplishments do not necessarily mean that what Vince did was good for pro wrestling. And a lot of people these days, I think it's a cope. They start saying, well, look at what Vince did for the business. Guys get paid more than ever. And, you know, the amount of fans that go to like a WrestleMania were unheard. The amount of fans that fill up a stadium for WrestleMania were unheard of in the kayfabe days, in the territory era, right? So there's this concept of the more money it makes, that's what makes it successful. And I don't agree with that. I don't believe it's all about money. I don't believe that just because a industry is producing the most money it's ever produced means that that industry itself is successful. For one thing, when you look at the history of pro wrestling before Vince took it national, right? You had, I think at the peak of the kayfabe era, you had 33 territories running full-time circuits, full-time territories in North America. Now we know that with the advent of cable TV, the spread of cable, that was going to come to an end, because the beauty of the territories was that you could run your promotion. So let's say it's Florida Championship Wrestling. You get TV all over in the different markets in your territory, and you run your 1 hour show. Maybe you have two shows, and the purpose of that is for the fans to get a taste of the action, but yet to go to the local house show, buy tickets. And so that's how it was. They had their TV show. They'd feature the wrestlers. A lot of times they were squash matches. And then they would have the interview segments where they would hype up the next house show at the local arena. And some territories ran weekly, all their cities weekly, and some did monthly, like AWA, WWF. And the beauty of this system was that nobody outside of Florida could see Florida Championship Wrestling. So a wrestler, once his star was starting to burn out, meaning he was overexposed in that territory, the fans had seen him too much, there was really nothing else you could do with him. The beauty of that was he can go then to the mid-Atlantic territory, which was the Carolinas and Virginia, and nobody from there had seen him in Florida. So he was fresh and new to them. And the cycle would repeat. Once he got kind of played out in Mid-Atlantic, he can go to Georgia or WWF or AWA. And you can make a career as a pro wrestler, going to different territories throughout your career, never burning your star out, but keeping yourself fresh for a new set of fans each territory you went to, whether it was Pacific Northwest, Portland, the LA territory, Mike LaBelle, San Francisco, Roy Shires, the Sheik in Detroit. So that's how wrestling was. Well, we know that was coming. That eventually had to end because of cable TV. Even back in 1979 at the NWA annual meeting, Mike LaBelle, the Los Angeles promoter, expressed concern that Georgia Championship Wrestling was now on the Superstation on Channel 17, which became WTCG, and once it went on the satellite, it became WTBS. There was already concern as far back as 1979, and apparently the story is that when Terry Funk, who ran with his brother Dory Funk Jr., the Amarillo territory, when they saw Georgia Championship Wrestling on cable, they decided to sell their promotion. They knew that that was going to be the end of wrestling, territorial wrestling. So people say, well, Vince didn't ruin pro wrestling. It was inevitable that there were promotions that were going to go national because of this fact that cable TV was starting to spread throughout the country, and now fans were getting to see wrestling matches in other territories that otherwise they wouldn't see. And so what would that do? That would inevitably hurt the local promotion. So if you're running Central States out of Kansas City, Kansas, you're the only game in town. And to the local fans there, you guys are the big leagues. Well, now they're able to see Georgia Championship Wrestling on WTBS. They're able to see WWF on USA Network, right? And World Class Championship Wrestling at this time is starting to expand their syndication package from Dallas. So now you could see other territories. And if you're Central States, a fan in the Central States area, you're looking at these wrestlers from these bigger promotions, and now your guys don't appear so major league. And this is what would hurt the territory system. Is in the territory system, your local fans thought that you were the big leagues. But now the spread of cable and then being able to see these other promotions that are in bigger geographic areas or more populated geographic areas, now your guys don't seem that big time. Even though even the smaller territories would have great stars. I mean, if you look at the Portland territory, I mean, it was filled with major stars in the 70s and early 80s. You're talking about Iron Sheik, Jesse the Body Ventura, Jimmy Superfly Snuka in his prime was the top babyface in Portland from 1972 to 78, minus 1977, where he wrestled in Dallas. And later on, Roddy Piper, Rick Martel, Kurt Hennig, Dynamite Kid, all were big stars in Portland. Billy Jack Haynes. So by the time Vince decides to take WWF nationwide, with obviously his goal to be the only promotion in the world, in the country at least, we have to ask ourselves, was that good for wrestling? And people say it's inevitable, and I totally disagree with that, right? Because how could it be good for wrestling to have one major promotion monopolize the business? One, and this is what wrestling suffered in the 90s, was a lack of new stars due to the destruction of the territories. There were no new stars coming up in the late 80s, early 90s, right? Because Vince had decimated the territories with a little bit of help from Jim Crockett, right? Decimated the territories. So by the late 80s, no new stars were coming up. And the first half of the 90s in pro wrestling was an awful time. And because, and this leads to another thing. How could we say that what Vince did was good for pro wrestling? What people don't realize is in 1983, the year before Vince launched his national expansion, he was already making moves in 1983. Okay, there's him and Ole Anderson at Georgia Championship Wrestling were already fighting over Ohio and Pennsylvania, parts of Western Pennsylvania. Vince had already expanded in Southern California. That's how I became a fan. So in 1983, because this myth that Vince McMahon has created and convinced people of that he saved pro wrestling is a total lie. 1983, before Vince took the WWF nationwide, World Class Championship Wrestling had their biggest year. The AWA had its biggest money-making year. I mean, look at Super Sunday with 28,000 fans. I believe it's 27,000. You know, the Roy Wilkins Auditorium in St. Paul Civic Center sold out for Bockwinkel and Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan was the number one babyface. 1983 was a huge year for the AWA. Jim Crockett, Mid-Atlantic, the Flair for the Gold leading up to Starrcade 83, and they just had the final conflict in Greensboro where they had to turn thousands of fans away with Kernodle and Slaughter against Steamboat and Youngblood. Mid-South, I think 83 was an okay year for them. Florida was in a downturn, so was Georgia. But overall, the business was very healthy. Now, even by the time Vince took the WWF nationwide, the territory system was already starting to decline. That started in the late 70s with, the decline of the LA territory, San Francisco, Detroit, Amarillo. And so things were already changing. Now, my theory is that Vince ruined pro wrestling. One, he created a work schedule with his national expansion that was unbearable. Why is it since Vince took over the wrestling world or started his national expansion, why is it that's when you begin to see the plethora of wrestlers dropping dead? The proliferation of the use of steroids once Vince took the business over from his father, because that's unmistakable. Not that there weren't steroids before. You could see wrestlers in the 70s and say, okay, that guy was juicing. But you compare that to the 80s, a world of difference. What was beautiful about the territorial era of wrestling, the kayfabe era, is you could have different body types. You could have a Nick Bockwinkel, regular athletic body. You could have a Dusty Rhodes, overweight but athletic. A Playboy Buddy Rose who could work, but a fat guy but could work his butt off in the ring. And then you had your Jimmy Snukas, who were built like Greek gods, and your Ricky Steamboats. That was the beauty of pro wrestling in the territorial era, was the variety. What Vince did was homogenize the sport to go after a specific type as the only type, largely. And the schedule, there was at one time where the WWF, I believe they were running 3 shows a night, an A, B, and C tour. I mean, guys were crisscrossing the country. I mean, they were living on planes and hotel rooms. So what happens with that type of brutal travel schedule where wrestlers have always had very full-time and sometimes very hard travel schedules. That's nothing new in wrestling. But the difference is, because it was territorial, you did a loop. So if you were in the AWA, you did, the AWA would use planes more because they were more spread out, but they would go to, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Denver, Omaha, Winnipeg, San Francisco, Salt Lake City. But it wasn't a brutal schedule because the AWA was running about 4 times a week. In Mid-South, you had a brutal schedule, but it was by car, right? You went through Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, parts of Mississippi, parts of Texas. Florida was probably the best loop because you just did the state, right? Mid-Atlantic. But Vince McMahon turned what was a hard travel schedule for the territories into a brutal travel schedule, where, from what I've read, it wasn't a loop. I mean, guys were crisscrossing the country, going from city to city with not a lot of thought into doing a loop where it made sense. Sometimes they did that, but a lot of times it was just crisscrossing the country. This is why the WWF work rate around 1986 was known as being very bad, because wrestlers were tired. And so what happens when wrestlers have to go through this brutal travel schedule and the pressure to look good on TV? Because Vince is into these big muscle type guys. Steroids, drugs to stay awake, or to go to sleep. So since Vince took over wrestling, you've had this plethora of wrestlers dying young in the 80s and 90s. I don't know about recently. How could that be good for the business? Because now fewer wrestlers were making more money than ever. I mean, Meltzer. Okay, so I have the Observer newsletter here. Now, this issue right here, December of '83. is historic because he says here, Iron Sheik upsets Backlund, wins WWF belt. Hogan Piper signed with WWF, and then he does an article about the wrestling war has begun. Meltzer talks about it at some point later on, how there used to be several hundred full-time pro wrestlers working in the business, making a living. Were they getting filthy rich? Most were not. But how many wrestlers got filthy rich under Vince? A few, right? So would you rather have a few wrestlers get filthy rich or a lot of wrestlers be able to at least make a living? And the one great thing about the territorial era was you had to love the business to be successful. Why? Because everything in the business was built to weed the wannabes out, to weed the people out that just wanted to do it to make money or whatever. And then because of the territorial system, you could take your time to learn your craft. You were working every day. And then once you obviously were going to start jobbing. And once you start to get experience, you would go from, say, central states where you were jobbing. People knew you as a jobber. You can go to Stampede in Canada. You can go maybe to Memphis. And now maybe you're winning a few matches, but you're getting better at your craft. And by the time you're ready to hit the mid card, you started to develop your character as time went on. And what was beautiful about the territorial era is wrestlers themselves were developing their own characters instead of just having some generic gimmick handed to them like Vince was giving to people. I mean, you look at the WWF/WWE, a lot of these guys, you don't buy their character. Why? Because it's generic. It's something that's given to them instead of them themselves developing it as an extension of who they are. Wrestling became less original and less authentic once Vince started taking the business over. You know, Vince's brand of wrestling, the cartoony brand, to me, ruined the WWF. A lot of the WWF fans that grew up in the Bruno Sammartino, Bob Backlund era were getting turned off. So Vince, he's altering the art form known as pro wrestling. It is an art form. We have to look at it like as performance art. Vince is taking away the psychology of it. Over the years, it would go from wrestlers working the match out in the ring, which breeds spontaneity, and making it scripted. Promos being scripted instead of wrestlers themselves ad-libbing. And then, of course, like I said, the proliferation of deaths since Vince McMahon took over the business. How is that good? How is it good that now only a few guys are making all kinds of money instead of hundreds of guys being able to make a living off of pro wrestling? So basically, that's what wrestling became, where several hundred guys can make a living off of it, to now just getting filthy rich off of it, but the rest, whatever. There's not even that. You can't even have, with one major promotion, and even two, you can't have that many full-time wrestlers. It shrunk the business. The business shrunk. Vince McMahon shrunk the business. It's basically like Walmart going into a town and running all the small mom and pops out. Hey, what's up, Faithful? When I was growing up in the 80s, the fans that were fans of the NWA, or more of a hardcore wrestling, we hated the WWF. We hated Vince McMahon. We said he was the Antichrist of pro wrestling, and so we looked at him. And then once the bloom started coming off the rose in the early 90s, you started seeing this in 1990. Then you have the steroid trial, right? You have the steroid trial. There were then things were coming out, sexual allegations against Vince McMahon by a female referee, Rita Chatterton, against Pat Patterson, who was gay, who was apparently being accused of sexual harassing some of the younger employees. Yeah, old school WWF. I love old school WWF. I loved it until around 1987. That's when I got turned off by it. And people, the cope that people use to kind of get McMahon off the hook for what I believe he ruined wrestling, the cope they use is, well, somebody would have went national. Somebody would have did what Vince did. And I say no. If Vince didn't go national, sure, eventually the territorial system could not survive the cable era. Consolidation was going to happen. But what I believe what would happen to pro wrestling if Vince either one didn't buy the business from his father or didn't take the business nationwide, I believe there would have been a more natural and healthy evolution of the business. The business has always evolved from when it first appeared on TV in the mid 1940s to when it burned itself out by the mid 50s. The business had always evolved. What I believe would happen, you would have had a more natural evolution of the business had Vince not bought the business from his father or he'd not taken it nationwide. There would have been a more natural evolution. People try to say, oh, well, it would have went the way of roller derby if Vince hadn't. That's a lie. That's a cope. These are people that just don't want to admit that Vince ruined the business. He made the business largely unwatchable. And I know old school fans, they try to watch today's product and it's almost like they're forcing themselves to watch it. They're forcing themselves to compliment it. I mean, you look at, because Vince has been the most successful, all these other companies that have tried to compete with Vince, or whether it's WCW in the 90s or whether it's AEW now, all they are is cheap imitations of the WWE. Nobody wants to be gritty, authentic, and original anymore. Even the NWA recently, which started off more of like kind of old school pro wrestling, started trying to be goofy, which is why Nick Aldis left, right? Honestly, I think pro wrestling right now is ripe to go back to what wrestling should be. Gritty storylines, authentic characters and gimmicks. And by the way, not everybody should have a gimmick. This is what's wrong with pro wrestling. You look at these wrestlers, and almost everybody has a gimmick. Everybody has some outlandish gimmick, or they're wearing some crazy costumes. What happened to the Nick Bockwinkel's, the Ray Stevens, the Lou Theszes, the Vern Gagnes, right? The Jack Briscoes, the Dory Funks. What happened to those type of wrestlers? Yeah. I mean, I knew Vince was a scumbag in the early 90s. I mean, I could tell him even in the 80s. I never liked him. Vince is bad for wrestling. I mean, you look at what's happened today. This stuff has been going on since the 80s, guys. And if we knew what was going on, if it had been exposed back then, Vince rightly would have had to do one of two things: sell his company. Because the culture of the WWE isn't just Vince, it's his wife. She's no better. She has to know this stuff goes on. Totally Stepford wife. And if this would have been caught in the bud, nipped in the bud, he would have never been able to build WWF to what it is today. So it's a company built on lies, a company built on abuse, toxic culture, total disregard for the safety of wrestlers. Look at the Owen Hart situation. Total disregard for the health of the wrestlers. Look at the brutal travel schedules at the peak of WWF. Look at the allowance of allegedly letting a doctor in the locker room to just proliferation of steroids. And the wrestling business today is largely a spoof of what pro wrestling is. And the cope by pro wrestling fans, oh, well, it's all fake anyways, and it's fake. Yes, but it's an art. And you look at actors that are serious actors, and they treat their art with respect. I'm tired of pro wrestling fans using the cope. Well, it's fake, so it should be silly. No, it shouldn't be. It's an art. You don't see people in movies wink at the audience. You see actors when they're interviewed about the roles that they play in their movies, they take it serious. They're respectful of it. And it's like wrestlers are almost ashamed to have respect for their own business. Why? Because that's what Vince has instilled in people. Because secretly he hates what pro wrestling was. And now his legacy is ruined. Again, his business, WWE, is built on abuse, toxicity, lies, scandal. It's nothing to be proud of. I'm sorry. Vince has always played dirty. And then the cope is, oh, well, look at the other promoters. Well, I'm sorry, but Vern Gagne, Fritz Von Erich, Jim Crockett, Roy Shire, Eddie Graham, Mike LaBelle, Don Owen, Sam Muchnick. I've never heard about any of those guys raping women and defecating on their head. So don't use that cope. Yep. Brock Lesnar got mentioned in that complaint, as did John Laurinaitis. And all you've seen people over the last 20 years kiss Vince's ass, these ex-pro wrestlers. Why? Because they know he's the only game in town, and they're desperate to have anything to do with WWE since Vince has put everybody out of business. And all they do is kiss Vince's ass. I mean, to hear Ric Flair talk about Vince is like, it's nauseating. I'm sorry, but if you were in the WWE for any length of time as a wrestler, you had to see this, know this stuff was going on. I knew it as a fan. I knew it as a fan. So what we have now with this fallout, now what will be the future of WWE? They'll probably be okay. Now the question is, oh yeah, faithful man. I've been listening to Jim Cornette's podcast the last few days, but he was kind of another guy that was kind of like a Vince apologist, and now all of a sudden, but anyways, the future of WWE is interesting, right? Because give the devil his due, Vince was the guy that made WWE into what it is. His drive, determination. And the one thing about pro wrestling is you can't just put anybody in charge of the creative aspect of it. WCW is proof that it's not about money. You can't just be a millionaire or billionaire like Ted Turner and run a pro wrestling business. So we call it in pro wrestling money marks, guys that just have a lot of money, but they don't know. Pro wrestling is unique business. This is why the future of WWE is very interesting. Just because these guys who run it now are billionaires, a $1 billion company, doesn't mean it's going to be successful. Wrestling is a unique business. Not anybody, just because they have money, can run, or even they could be the best executive of any other business. When you come into pro wrestling, it is super unique. So what's going to happen is anybody associated with Vince, the Bruce Pritchards of the world, will probably not have any influence in the company anymore. Now, these were the guys that made WWE into what it was. Eric Bischoff, why? Well, I've never heard anything about Eric Bischoff. Faithful, what did you hear about him? So, what will happen? What will happen with Triple H? Will Triple H run the business? Will Stephanie come back? Or maybe Maybe the McMahon name is tarnished where even Stephanie McMahon can't come back. Maybe Triple H will be kind of put away because he's Vince McMahon's son-in-law. Oh, you just don't like him? So that's what's going to be interesting. And then once the McMahon influence is completely gone, Bruce Pritchard's gone, maybe Triple H, I don't know. Because the history has proven that you have to be non-wrestling people who've been successful in every form of business with a lot of money. They haven't done well in pro wrestling. Look at Eddie Einhorn when he did the IWA thing, or even Pro Wrestling USA. Look at Ted Turner in WCW. Non-wrestling people, no matter how successful they are, almost always fail in pro wrestling because it's such a unique business. You can't run it like any other business. Now, what about AEW? What does this say? I don't know. AEW is known. It's a joke. It's AEW represents everything that's wrong with pro wrestling. A spoof, stupid gimmicks, and it's known as being woke, by the way, and just trying like a cheap imitation of WWE. It's like, why does every promotion feel like they have to be a cheap imitation of WWE? Why can't they just stick with having their own brand, their own culture, their own formula, their own way of presenting pro wrestling that's unique? Why does everybody feel like they have to be like WWE? All you do is come off as a cheap imitation. This is the problem with Billy Corgan and NWA. It's like, dude, you had something good. You were building a traditional brand, and you now start to do goofy stuff. It doesn't work unless you're WWE. Exactly. So they don't understand the fans of sport. Right now, this is, if you look at entertainment today, what do people like when they watch TV? What do you see on TV now? These like Netflix, whatever it is, you're seeing these series that they have. These series where you have a few seasons and several episodes in one season, and what keeps people watching it is the storylines. The interesting storylines, cliffhanger storylines, gritty storylines. That was once pro wrestling. Until McMahon formed it in his own image. It is goofy, carny, like stuff that's just like you can't take serious. Ring of Honor. I haven't watched too much of it, but I did go see a Ring of Honor show. So it was pretty good. Show. Wrestling needs to get back to the basics. Not everybody has to have some stupid gimmick. Not everybody has to wear all these outlandish costumes. What about a guy just in trunks and boots? And then if you go back to that, what makes it special is when a guy does have a gimmick, it's unique and it pops. And then you have this, like, because WWE created this, where it's like these mind-numbing, lengthy monologues these wrestlers do. It's like less is more in that area. Less is more. The bulk of the action should be in the ring. Some wrestling promoter needs to stop riding Vince's jock and say, I'm going to be unique. I'm going to present pro wrestling in a unique way that's not trying to be a carbon copy of the cartoon known as WWE. And we're going to be willing to be different. We're going to be mavericks, and we're going to pave a different way. Someone needs to have the balls to do that. Because Eric Bischoff in WCW, all he did was get these old retread WWF wrestlers like Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage and Roddy Piper, and what became WWF Light. AEW is just like a cheap imitation of WWE to me. Why not start a wrestling promotion and say, we're going to be gritty, we're going to be authentic, we're going to present wrestling as serious, we're going to respect it, And we're not going to try to do goofy shit like the WWF. Excuse my language. Fans are hungry for that. This whole cartoony version of pro wrestling is played out. It's played out. It's tired. It's so like they're still trying. It's like pro wrestling is still stuck in the 1980s and 90s with all this cartoony version, cartoony pro wrestling, gimmick pro wrestling. It's like they're stuck in a time warp. Someone needs to start a pro wrestling promotion. Say, we're going to take it serious. We're going to respect the sport. We realize it is kayfabe, whatever. We're going to present wrestling as serious, as competitive, gritty storylines, interesting storylines, not insulting your intelligence with the stupid, like it's like WWE produces television for like retards. They insult people's intelligence. Yes, I know pro wrestling is a work. People need to stop talking about, well, it's fake anyways. Well, a movie's fake. But what do you do when you go watch a movie? You suspend your disbelief for 2 hours. You absorb yourself into the storyline. And for 2 hours, you suspend your disbelief. I should be able to, is it too hard for pro wrestling to suspend to let fans suspend their disbelief for 2 hours? Why is it so hard? Why does it kill Vince and WWE to let fans suspend their disbelief? It's almost like that's become an evil thing in pro wrestling, to be able to suspend your disbelief. It's like they just, oh, it's fake anyway, so let's just clown it. Oh, why are you criticizing WWE or AEW for having these silly gimmicks? And so it's fake anyways. Well, movies are fake. So how would it look if Daniel Day-Lewis and There Will Be Blood came out and told you during the movie, oh, don't take us so serious anyways. We're going to just make fun of ourselves. No, the great actors transform themselves into that role. You buy them as that role they're playing. And for 2 hours, you're buying into everything they're doing. And that's what pro wrestling needs to return to. And Vince ruined it. He's a scumbag that should have never been allowed to run a pro wrestling business in the first place. Because you think this all is new? Like that idiot. I'm sorry, Jim Cornette's an idiot. Saying, the concussions. You idiot. He was doing this stuff before he ever stepped foot in a wrestling ring as a wrestler, and was doing this as a promoter in the mid-'80s. I mean, look at all the wrestlers that have died since Vince took over the business. This didn't happen before that. You didn't hear about wrestlers dropping dead at a young age in proliferation before Vince took over the business. Why? Because it makes more money? Well, for a few wrestlers instead of several hundred that were able to make a living? They didn't have to take steroids to be a big shot, big name. They didn't have to have these god-awful travel schedules where they're crisscrossing the country on an airplane, having to take drugs to stay awake and go to sleep. I was almost part of this business. There's no way I would ever want to be part of the pro wrestling business post Vince McMahon. Now, obviously, I'm way too young to have been an adult in the territory era, but I would have loved to work in pro wrestling at that time. And I'll be honest, when you look at WWF to now WWE, it's not that great. Yeah, okay, you have WrestleMania 3. I love WrestleMania 3. I love WrestleMania 1. Loved the mid-'80s. But after that, it just largely became unwatchable. I mean, come on, man. Us hardcore fans knew that. We were supporting NWA. I remember in the 80s, the hardcore fans supported NWA. The more kiddie fans supported WWF. And now all of a sudden, we're going to praise Vince McMahon and WWF was so great. That's rewriting history, revisionist history. WWF sucked in the late 80s. It was worse in the 90s. And yeah, give Vince credit. He created new stars, something he never did. Created new stars in the mid-'90s with Stone Cold Steve Austin and all this stuff. And you got to give Vince some credit for being able to compete with WCW in the late 90s and win the war. But I think wrestling now is ripe for a new era. A new era. Enough of this AEW garbage and WWE garbage. Just insult fans' intelligence. Everybody has some totally long-winded monologues that just numb you. Let's get back to a pro wrestling. Not trying to relive the old days. Not trying to, because that could become a spoof too. Like when NWA, I love NWA, but when they were kind of doing a little bit too much of like it was almost a spoof of the old days. But we need to have a pro wrestling. Back to the basics. Not everybody has to have a gimmick. None of these long-winded monologues. Enough talking to get fans into the storyline. Having serious storylines that play itself out over a long period of time. Having wrestlers having gritty characters. Because fans want that. They want that in other forms of entertainment. Fans love shows and movies with gritty, interesting storylines and interesting, gritty characters that they could suspend their disbelief for 2 hours. Is it too much to ask pro wrestling to do that? Yeah, we know it's fake. We know all that stuff. We don't need to hear it a million times. I don't need you to tell me it is. Have me buy into your product and suspend my disbelief. I'm not a retard. I'm going to be able to make a distinction between what's a shoot and what's a work. But Vince treats his fans like retards. So does AEW. I want to buy into the product. I want to suspend my disbelief for that 2 hours. I want to be able to go to an arena for 3 hours to watch a card and suspend my disbelief. And I'm mature enough to know to separate reality from fiction. Because this is a beautiful art, pro wrestling. And the people that partake in it should take it serious. That's their craft. It's a craft. Too many pro wrestlers feel like they have to make fun of their own business. No, it's a craft. That's how the old school wrestlers looked at it. It was a craft. And yeah, they kayfabed people. Because you could back then. Now we can't because you have the internet. You can't kayfabe anymore. That's fine. But you still don't need to make fun of it. You can still have respect for your craft. Because if you don't respect your craft, the people won't. Anyways. But it's interesting. This is from 1984, October 22nd. It's the Wrestling Observer newsletter. And this guy named Mondo Mike used to do these like kind of satire, kind of comedy pieces on Meltzer's Observer newsletter. I like this one. And this one's like Howard Finkel. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the worst wrestling federation, which has just taken over. Because this is, remember, right here, 1984 is the first year of Vince's national expansion. And then he says, he has Vince McMahon kind of talking here. He says, hello, everybody. This is Vincent K. McMadman. Indeed, perhaps you might say the megalomaniac responsible for ruining wrestlers in wrestling. See, we all knew he was ruining wrestling. I mean, Dave Meltzer knew Vince was ruining wrestling in 84 and 85. Now, all of a sudden, everybody's on Vince's jock, like he was this genius, and he did this great thing for pro wrestling. See how people revisionist history. He says, without a doubt, I'm making professional wrestling major league. Now, he's doing satire of what, like Vince talking. And I'm doing it by using wrestlers' traditional strength, poor taste. In fact, my vacuousness, I don't know how to, vacuousness or whatever, is huge and giant-like. Since I want to own everything, including the premier fanzine, let's take you now to a match up between myself and the rest of the world, oh my. Notwithstanding the fact that I drone on incessantly and am in love with my face, why else would I parade the Vinny Visage in every foreseeable instance? The way I pontificate, you've got to be kidding. And don't you love the way I'm rewriting history as everything is WWF related? Yeah. I mean, Vince was starting to rewrite history in the mid-'80s. And now he's rewritten history. That he saved pro wrestling. And I call BS on that. Why? because 1983 was one of the most successful years pro wrestling ever had, and that was before Vince went national. World Class, Mid-Atlantic, AWA, to name a few, they had great years that year. Then WWF, before they nationally expanded, had a great year in 83 with Jimmy Snuka as the number one babyface. So Vince McMahon didn't save anything. None of us believed that back then. The hardcore fans, we believed he was ruining wrestling. Now all of a sudden, these hardcore fans, oh, he saved it. Look at how much money it makes. Yeah, for very few people. Instead of several hundred who are making decent livings and some great livings. More people employed. So if you like Walmart, then you'll like Vince McMahon and the WWE. So mid-'80s, I knew he was ruining wrestling. I'm not going to change it now, 50 years later, because he's made several $billion, whatever. Money doesn't make you successful, man. I'm sorry. It's not all about money. That is such an egotist, empty vessel way of thinking. Anyways, it's going to be interesting to see the fallout. But right now, anyways, bye.